Our next presenter is a young scholar who's relatively new to Chicago. He's an assistant professor in African American Studies, trained political scientist, member of the Chicago Council for Black Studies. Let's welcome him to probably give one of his few first remarks in Chicago, Dr. Miller.
Good morning. Dr. Mills was right up my alley a little bit where I want to begin my remarks. And Brother Haki mentioned something in his talk that I want to draw on for the beginning of my discourse. But first I want to thank Brother Armstead and Brother Bart for inviting me to be on this panel. All right, now, first let me frame it for you in this way. I'm from Philadelphia. My father was briefly in the Nation of Islam. His leaving the Nation of Islam was concurrent with Malcolm X leaving the Nation of Islam. My father was also a member of, well, purportedly a member of RAM. He also was purportedly a member of the Black Panther Party, very briefly. But I want to go back. You know, Haki talked about, well, the organizations that really stand on the shoulders of Malcolm. He talked about RAM. He mentioned the African Liberation Support Committee. He mentioned the Black Panther Party. He mentioned us. And we can go on and we can talk about the Black Studies movement. We can talk about the Institute of Black World. We can talk about DRUM. We can talk about a whole host of organizations. Now, I'm always starting the discussion this way because it's very important in terms of my book, at least for me it is. In 1969, Dr. Penderhughes can correct me if I'm wrong, 1969, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists was founded, right? 68, 69, and 70, you saw in the academy, just not Black studies, but outside in Black psychology and economics and sociology, all forming their own organizations, institutions within the academy. So for political scientists, it was the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And the reason you see this being formed and founded is because people are dealing with the question of paradigms and worldview. What particular frame is your framework that you're going to operate out of when we're trying to understand this mess, right? And with the primary emphasis being on how do we solve Black people's problems, right? So at that time, we're concerned with the language we're seeing is liberation, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, white supremacy, right? So even for Atlanta University, which created one of the first Black PhD programs in political science, Howard University is the other one at a Black institution, and NCOPES, their first journal, about 72, 73, was titled the Journal of Political Repression. Huh? Now, the title of the journal is the National Political Science Review. The Journal of Political Repression only lasted about 2 years. Now, I asked Mac Jones, who's one of the editors and one of the stalwarts in Black political science, said, well, what happened to the journal? He said, well, people trying to get tenure. Now, but what's happened since then, and I wrote a paper about 8 years ago dealing with, the title was Confused Paradigm, Black Politics of Black Political Science. I sent it to the National Political Science Review, and I hope I'm not saying anything that I shouldn't say, but I sent it, and it was rejected by the editor. They didn't send it to the editorial board. And the editor said, correctly, in one way, not correctly in a substantive way, but correctly on the surface, is that your paper is dealing with issues that we're not currently discussing in political science. I'm paraphrasing, right? Now, the editor is correct. Because what we see in academia really is a rejection of folk who say that they're African-centered and concerned about nationalism and Pan-Africanism. And I'm so happy for Mills to use the term white supremacy because people don't use that term anymore. right? People run away from that term, right? So now it's valid when you want to say that I'm a Democrat socialist, that's okay. If you want to say I'm a post-structuralist, that's okay. If you want to say I'm a postmodernist, a post-behavioralist, a neo-Marxist, all those things are okay. But if you say I'm an African-centered scholar, then you're not really being scholarly, right? Okay, so when we look at Marable's work, right? When we look at Marable's work, we see a rejection of that throughout the text, right? We see his interjection of the radical democratic socialists. We see his paradigm that he's operating out of color the lens of his text, right? Now, to be fair, the best chapter for me is his last chapter, because that seems to be the part where he allows Malcolm to speak for himself. All right, now, let's move on to the next part, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind and put the things in the context, I want us, the books about Malcolm, before Marable and what Marable did and what was already out there. Now, you had Peter Goldman's The Death and Life of Malcolm X, right? Which was an important book. Goldman published that book in about 1973. Now, that book is important because Goldman was able to interview people at that time who ran with Malcolm, particularly before he joined the nation. All right? Very important. Now, Goldman's analysis and things may be problematic, but that's very important that he's able to use that. He's able to use some primary sources that people have died and other people haven't been able to interview, so that's very important, right? The other books that came out on Malcolm X, to me, that are very important. Carl Evans' The Judas Factor, which came out, published in 1992, but it's very important. Evans said, I actually finished that in law school in 1981, but I couldn't publish it because nobody was interested in it. And because of Spike Lee's film, that drove interest. That's why the book got published in 1992, right? Judas Factor is very important in terms of drawing out John Ali, the national secretary for the Nation of Islam, who lived right above Malcolm. Him and his wife lived right above Malcolm and Betty in the same apartment before he became national secretary. Carl Evans also, in 1996, published The Messenger, about Elijah Muhammad. Come back to that. Very important. Next piece is very important. The Carroll's piece, On the Side of My People, A Religious History of Malcolm X, which was published in 1996 as well. Very important work, very strong work. Now, why are these works important? Because what do they draw on? And this is what I want to show, because in terms of Marable and what Marable was attempting to do, Marable said, in light of all these books are out here on Malcolm, right? And of course, I didn't say the autobiography. I'm just assuming you all know I'm talking about autobiography as well. Marable's promise for what he's saying in terms of what is going to be new in this work is that, one, we're going to deal with the missing chapters, right? That Alex Haley decided, or Alex and Malcolm, depending on what you believe, decided to pull out and then not put in the text. So that's the first thing, right? So, but what's interesting is this. If you want anything new on Malcolm, you have to deal with private letters. You have to deal with his travel diaries, which Marable did. You have to deal with the missing chapters. In a sense, you have to deal with the Malcolm X Schomburg collection, which is relatively new that a lot of other scholars did not have access to. The Malcolm X file at the Schomburg collection is new, which Marable did draw on, right? And the FBI files. Later, more and more, some of these files are becoming more and more open as the years go on. So some scholars have more access than other scholars, right? Evans drew on the FBI files a lot in the Judas Factor and in The Messenger. DeCarroll draws on it as well, right? And also interviews, archival footage, interviews with people who knew Malcolm, right? So Marable uses the travel diaries. Malcolm uses some FBI files. But the missing chapters, which is really the selling point for his book, he had only 15 minutes to look at. Now, that's not his fault. The lawyer, Gregory Reed in Detroit, only gave him 15 minutes to do that, right? So a part of his promise Marable is incapable of reaching because he just didn't have the time to look at those missing chapters. Now, we're going to deal with the strength of Marable's work, right? Those travel diaries are a strength of his work. Even though he wasn't able to deal with the missing chapters, Marable's travel diaries and his discussion on Malcolm and what Malcolm was doing overseas is very important. It goes beyond, this is really one of the few places that it goes beyond the autobiography and starts filling in some things about what Malcolm was doing overseas and who he's seeing. So that's very important. But what's interesting is that Marable, through most of the book, leans heavily, is one book I forgot to mention, I'll mention in a second. He leans very heavily on Goldman, on Evans, on DeCaro, and he doesn't go beyond what they did. That's very important. The first couple hundred pages, Marable's not giving you anything new. So as a scholarly achievement, it's not very big. And I'm not saying that to disparage Manny Marable. I respect Manny Marable. But we want to be clear about where his work stands. All right? And the part where people say, well, this is new in terms of the assassination of Malcolm, in terms of fleshing out how it happened and who was involved, the other book that I forgot to mention, and I should have mentioned, is Zach Kondo. Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X. All right? Where Talmadge Hayer had named his co-conspirators way back in 1970. First, he told his lawyer, William Kunstler, and he also told Tony Brown in Tony Brown's journal. Right? So that wasn't a secret as well. If people pay attention, but people don't read. Right? So people have known about the assassins for a while. Zach Kondo says that Marable, when you read him unraveling, talking about the assassination, he is really going line by line of what Zach Kondo had. Now, one of the issues is that he doesn't cite Zach Kondo. But even though he interviewed Zach Kondo and told Zach Kondo that his book was an excellent book, right? But Zach Kondo did the work in fleshing out the assassination. Now, this goes back to really, when we're dealing with Zach Kondo isn't a postmodern scholar, or he's a black nationalist. He's Pan-Africanist, right? He's not an Ivy League scholar, right? So his work goes unnoticed. Carl Evans would call himself a black nationalist, and he's a journalist, not an Ivy League scholar. His work went unnoticed except by activists. Is that right? So they didn't get the attribution that they should have got. They didn't get the respect they should have gotten in their work. Next point. One of the things that Marable, strengths of Marable's book, he does give a little backstory, which is important in terms of some of the growing animosity towards Malcolm within the Nation of Islam. He does put on some of those things that were before people did not know. He mentioned one of his strengths was mentioning one of the national ministers, James Hassan, and his Malcolm taking over his brother's position, or his brother, Wilbert, taking over his brother's position in Detroit, in Cincinnati, after Malcolm went and gave a speech, and they just saw what Malcolm was doing, and they saw brother Hassan, they said, well, you're not doing a good job. His brother in the national leadership in Chicago had some animosity behind that. So things like that is good what Marable does. And this last chapter, reflecting on the revolutionary vision, is very good. Now, what are the weaknesses? And I'm going to come back to his strengths in a second. What are his weaknesses? One, there's no missing chapters, which again is the promise. And again, we have to give him a pass on that because he only had 15 minutes, but you shouldn't have sold us a bill of goods, right? No missing chapters. Two, his other main point was that Alex Haley had a duplicitous relationship with the FBI, which I was looking for, how does he draw this out? And he does not make a convincing connection. He shows that Alex Haley's white collaborator, on the first essay he did on the nation was feeding information to the FBI. But he does not show, for me, that Alex Haley knew, right? Or that Alex Haley was feeding information to the FBI. So again, that is weak, a weak piece. 3, his questionable use of sources, right? You know, one source interestingly where he said that Betty Shabazz came and stormed in and accused Lynn Shiflett and another OAU staffer of having an affair with Malcolm X. His source that he cited was Max Stanford, who was the founder of RAND. Right? But what's interesting, what Marable does is he says, according to Max Stanford, Betty stormed in. He says that. Right? But if you go to his footnotes, his endnotes, there's no citation. So I called Brother Stanford, and I asked him. I said, well, what's going on here? Right? Well, let me set this up for you. Earlier in the book, he mentions that Max Stanford and the brothers in RAM were upset with Malcolm because of how hard he was going on the Elijah Muhammad affairs and, immoral things, right? They were ready to pull back from Malcolm because they didn't think that really was pertinent. But Max Stanford said, well, because of his relationship to Elijah Muhammad and love for him, we kind of understood where that was coming from, so we decided to still work with Malcolm. But we didn't think that was pertinent. So here in the book, Manning Marable is quoting Max Stanford talking about Malcolm's or Betty's problems. So my first question is, well, Max, how you do that? How do you get mad at Malcolm for putting Elijah Muhammad on Front Street, but then you do it with Betty? Well, this is what Max Stanford told me. He said, well, brother, he said, my conversation with Manning Marable was off the record and meant to be off the record, right? He said that was my understanding, right? Next point. One of the weaknesses, big weaknesses for me, and this is where, again, that other scholars have trailblazed for Marable and us, and Marable kind of does not utilize it because he picks and chooses now. When he's using William Paul Lenin, he's using 2 sources. He's using brother Malcolm Shorty Jarvis, who wrote a small book which Cornel West helped publish. Cornel West wrote the introduction and talked about how it was an important book. In that book, Malcolm Jarvis is talking about Malcolm's alleged homosexuality. And the other source is his nephew, Rodnell Collins, who wrote a book with Peter Bailey, who was in the OAAU. Right? So that's the source he uses for Malcolm's alleged homosexuality. Now, the first problem is that his description of the act is, he says it's a homosexual relationship. The first problem is that's not a homosexual relationship, what he's describing. Right? That's the first problem. Right? The second problem is he's making leaps that other people aren't making. Now, he says that Malcolm's discussion of Rudy was really about himself. Right? Now, again, this depends on how you look at information. This is all speculation, right? Malcolm did have another burglary partner, Francis Brown, in Boston. DeCaro, in his book, because of his paradigm, DeCaro says that Francis Brown was probably the Rudy in the movie and in the autobiography. Manning Marable suggests that the Rudy is Malcolm, right? All opinion. But it depends on your particular framework. Why does Marable assume that Malcolm's lying? Why does DeCaro assume that the Rudy character is Sonny Brown, right? First thing. Next thing is flimsy evidence. We have more evidence that John Ali was an FBI informant. Marable does not go into any detail on John Ali. We have evidence that Captain Joseph, and this is very interesting, Marable mentions Captain Joseph a few times, Captain Joseph Yusuf Shaw. He mentions him a couple of times. Captain Joseph's father was Joseph Gravidel, was a member of the Moorish Science Temple of America, was a friend and colleague of Elijah Muhammad, who was also in the Moorish Science Temple of America, which the nation denies, right? So in the book that Marable has, he never mentions Joseph's father and that relationship to Elijah Muhammad. Carl Evans does that, right? Is that important? Why do you leave it out? He never mentions that Farrakhan's brother, Alvin Muhammad, was one of the ones that firebombed Malcolm's house. Is that important? Do we need to know that? He doesn't mention how the relationship between Alvin Farrakhan and Captain Joseph. Some of you know Captain Joseph. If you ever seen Make It Plain or any other video, you've seen his little short brother who hates Malcolm's guts, right? And you don't need to be a scholar, you don't even need to have a bachelor's degree to know when you hear him talk that he has something to do with Malcolm's murder, right? You don't, right? So, Captain Joseph was friends with Alvin Farrakhan, who died in 1994, a year before the Million Man March. Alvin Farrakhan was at the Harlem Mosque, right? And again, involved, there's 3 people that we know of at least involved in the bombing: Edward X, Captain Joseph, and Alvin Farrakhan at Malcolm's house, right? Edward X and, well, Farrakhan is not mentioned in the text at all. Farrakhan's older brother is not mentioned in the text at all. Next point, where it becomes problematic, a very important figure, Jeremiah Shabazz. His name is Jeremiah Pugh. Maybe this is my bias because I'm from Philadelphia, right? But Jeremiah Pugh ran a Philadelphia mosque. In that time, 10 years later, today, and maybe even 10 years from now, people will call that mosque the gangster mosque. Right? Right? Now, I'm not even saying that this is still a gangster mosque, but because they did so much stuff that people still say that's the gangster mosque. Right? The known fact, selling drugs out of the mosque, killing people, that's the gangster mosque. Jeremiah Pugh and Captain Joseph, you know, they have, if you know, the internet is such a beautiful thing sometimes. You go on the internet, you can see they give a lecture called a biography of Malcolm X. And you can hear Jeremiah Shabazz and Captain Joseph give their opinions of Malcolm X. But Jeremiah Shabazz is the one that was over this Philadelphia mosque. He also went to Atlanta and ran the mosque in Atlanta, set up the, when Malcolm had to meet with the Ku Klux Klan, that was Jeremiah Shabazz there as well. Jeremiah Shabazz had the mosque in Philadelphia where the Black Mafia operated out of. They were only nominally Muslim. This is where they went and killed the members of the Hanafi Muslims in Washington, D.C., right? This is Jeremiah Shabazz, right? And those of you who still watch BET, you probably seen him on American Gangster when they did an episode on the Philadelphia Black Mafia, right? Right? That's Jeremiah Shabazz. There's no mention of Jeremiah Shabazz in the book, right? No mention of him in the book. The next piece that's very important, and this is what Evans does in his work that's very important, in The Messenger. Evans does an excellent job of detailing Elijah Muhammad's history, right? Not simply his relationship to Noble Drew Ali and the Moorish Science Temple of America, not specifically that, but we see in the 1930s how the language that Elijah Muhammad was using, because he was talking about people coming to bomb America and we're going to take this thing over. The FBI had him under surveillance as early as 1933, right? Elijah Muhammad went to jail in 1943. When Elijah got out of jail, this is important, y'all, because of that history. Now, Elijah and the Nation of Islam says we follow the laws of America, right? Now we're starting to understand a little deeper. See, Malcolm being suspended wasn't simply a personal thing. Elijah Muhammad was real on it. He says, look, we're not going to say anything bad about the president. We're not going to talk about threatening this country. We're not going to use that kind of language. You can talk about the white devils, you can talk about this, that, and the other, but we're not going to do it. Because I saw what happened to myself and my organization in the 1930s. There's a history there, right? So even before Malcolm joins the nation, Elijah Muhammad is already under surveillance. The Nation of Islam is already. So he joins an institution, an organization that's under surveillance, that has already been compromised by FBI informants. Right? By 1957, they have wiretaps and bugs in Elijah's house, which is very important. Now, one interesting thing, and this is Amiri Baraka was going hard on Marable's book for two reasons. One, that Marable is really separated from the history of black activist struggle in America, particularly during the 1960s and how people organize and how people do things, right? So that's one. And that's really that's a long-going critique of activists, of people who are in the academy, right? The second piece that he says is that his usage of these FBI files. The fact that he believes that these files, they're lying, right? How do we trust the FBI files? But that raises a significant question. What sources do we trust? Do we trust the FBI sources? Do we trust the interviews, right? The interviews detailing, not even detailing, the interviews or the sources he uses for Malcolm's alleged relationship with Sharon Poole, he uses two sources. Abdul Razak, with James 67X, and he uses another brother, Abdul Rahman Muhammad, who's a journalist who's I don't know who he is, just a journalist or whatever. He uses the same two sources for that. Now, why is that important? Well, for some people who were around Malcolm at the time, including Earl Grant, who he didn't interview for the book, questioned James 67X. They questioned his motives. So we don't know. Second thing why that's important, and this is what Brother Hakeem mentioned, this is what his own enemies mentioned. Everything everybody is clear about. Malcolm was one of the most moral people you would ever want to meet. He was clean, disciplined, to the 10th degree. Farrakhan says that. Captain Joseph said it. Jeremiah Shabazz said it. People that hate Malcolm said it. Right? Even those people at that time, when they were trying to denigrate Malcolm, never even said that he did anything out of bounds. His own enemies. Right? Now we have someone who loved Malcolm who says these things. Right? Which the FBI files don't even show. Very important. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying if it did happen, Malcolm's very slick. The people around him are very slick. They're very... People talk. And none of these things ever came out. So that's very interesting. And the last thing, and I want to wrap up on this, in terms of what needs to be done. More work needs to be done on the OAU and Muslim Mosque Incorporated members. More interviews need to be done. We need to really flesh that history out. And this is another weaknesses of Marable's work. He interviewed Herman Ferguson for the book, and it seems that he didn't even know who Herman Ferguson was. Now, again, I'm not saying that to denigrate Randall Marable, but it's very important. He uses his website at Columbia University, Malcolm X Project. He has some of these interviews online. And in his biography of Herman Ferguson, he talks about him being a school teacher and organizing something, but he doesn't talk about, really, Herman Ferguson was a member of OAU and Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and also a member of RAM, who was not only incarcerated, but had to go out of the country for 19 years and live in Guyana. They're writing a biography about him now, if some of you are connected to that listserv know. So Herman Ferguson was considered in those circles a revolutionary activist, right? But Marable doesn't make that connection from Ferguson to RAM and Malcolm X's legacy. The last point I want to make, Dr. John Henry Clark, who was a colleague and a friend of Malcolm X, said that when Malcolm died, Dr. Clark was crying, and he was around white people. Well, actually, I want to do two things left. And a white person said, "Why is he crying?" And Dr. Clark said, "Well, you know, he was a great leader and a hero for us." And the guy said, "Well, this guy was a killer, a racist, and what makes him, what makes him such a great leader?" And Dr. Clark simply said, "Because we said so." Because we said so. And my last point, and I'm going to pull this from DeCarroll's work. In Marable's text, he locates a speech that Malcolm did right after he left the nation at the Militant Labor Forum, which is a group of largely white Marxists and socialists, or white Marxists. Right? So he says this plainly. This speech marks the first time that Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam. Right? Now, DeCarroll cites that same speech for different reasons. During that speech in the question and answer period, a white member of that organization challenged Malcolm and said, well, since you're this new Malcolm, and you consider me your brother in humanity? And Malcolm said, sure. Right? And the guy said, well, such and such, a white man just died. Will you say anything about that person? And are you sorry that this white man died in the struggle? Da, 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 da. Right? Here's Malcolm's response. We're not going to stand up and applaud any contribution made by some individual white person when 22 million black people are dying every day. What the dead civil rights worker did was good. Hooray, hooray, hooray. Now Lumumba was murdered, Medgar Evers was murdered, my own father was murdered. You tell that stuff to someone else. It's time that some white people started dying in this thing. Right? This is where Marable says Malcolm made the break from the Nation of Islam. Ideologically. But Marable doesn't cite that. See, we have to be very careful, and this is why, for scholars, we can't just accept what other scholars say in interpretation. We have to be very careful when we go back and mine these sources and really look and see what people said. And I'm right here. Marable's point was that Malcolm was developing really into this democratic socialist, right? And Malcolm never let go of his Pan-Africanism, right? Malcolm never let go of using the term white supremacy and calling it for what it was, right? Malcolm did have a focus on internationalism, but we cannot read internationalism as being something that's alien to black nationalism, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for taking your charge very seriously and providing us with an incisive treatment of Marable's book, which perhaps is just the beginning.